Tours in central France was the site of one of the most important battles in history in the year 732. The forces of the Franks and Aquitanians faced off against the Umayyad Caliphate, where Charles Martel led the victorious Europeans in fighting back the expansion of Muslim forces. The Umayyad Caliphate was established in 661 and had expanded their territory across all of northern Africa and into the Iberian Peninsula, looking to drive further into Western Europe. Just 3 decades earlier, in the year 632, the Rashidun Caliphate was established and expanded their territory from the Arabian Peninsula. In a series of military victories over the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sassanid Persians, the rapid expansion of territory set the stage for one of the largest empires in early modern history. The establishment of this first caliphate, a derived word in Arabic to denote a political religious ruler who derives power as a successor selected by God, occurred upon the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Born in 570 to a tribal leader in the trading city of Mecca, Muhammad was raised by his grandfather and uncle after the death of his parents. Around the age of 40, he was visited by the angel Gabriel and received the revelation of the words of God. Muhammad faced opposition in Mecca as he preached of an all-powerful single God, shared by Judaism and Christianity. He migrated from Mecca to Medina in 622 and eventually raised an army of his faithful followers to conquer Mecca 7 years later in 629. By the time of his death, just 3 years later, the Islamic faith, as shared by Muhammad through his revelations from God, had unified the entire Arabian Peninsula. The clash of Muhammad's successors and the forces of Charles Martel 100 years later illustrate the vast changes of political entities and the military power on the European continent that had occurred over the preceding centuries. Their legacies remain felt today.
Welcome to the History of Modern Politics. That voice was Matt Wittlief, and my name is Chris Spangle, and we thank you so much for joining us. You can get early release episodes at thehistoryofmodernpolitics.com. Sign up there for reading lists and outlines and video and all kinds of extras. If you aren't a Wall Plus patron, you can sign up at historyofmodernpolitics.com. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, Matt, why is this story important?
Yeah, I mean, this story really helps us set the stage of, what is going on throughout the continent. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, most of our story arc is concerning the British as we ultimately get to, modern politics. And you can't tell the story of Britain without the story of France. Right. There's ongoing wars between the French and the British. It's like a national pastime for both of them. And we need to understand the dynamics of how the French came to be in order to talk about, kind of what comes next. And, we'll learn later that even the early kings of England that we'll talk about, really are French people, right?
Yeah, I mean, in doing this show, I've been surprised to learn that French was the official language of England for a very long time. Much of our English words come from the French of this period, and legal French was the way that lawyers did business for a very long time in England.
Yeah. And, Charles Martel, we'll get to him featured later here in the episode, but that clash with the Muslim world in his lifetime really is reviewed in history as kind of being what could have been a massive potential turning point, right? Even in modern days, we hear of the fear of the spread of communism or Hitler taking over everything or the Muslims taking over everything, and this is one of those moments in history where Martel being victorious in the Battle of Tours, is viewed as potentially having prevented the Muslim world, the Caliphate, spreading throughout the entire continent of Europe.
Yeah, we could all be Muslim instead of Christian. I mean, because we're this story that we're talking about today is 395 to 885. Islam comes around in the 600s and rapidly starts to expand. And we still feel those tensions today. And you obviously want to talk about the Crusades and how important that was in future episodes. But today's episode really just shows that Britain isn't an isolated outpost. Much like today, China versus America versus Russia, there's a lot of interconnectedness. There's a lot of tension that comes about from that. And it's not all bad. It's not all good. It's just is what it is.
It is what it is, yeah.
You're connected militarily, economically, culturally, and dynastically. So we started this episode, it was titled, if you look at the original outline that we posted in our introduction episode, this is going to be about the Holy Roman Empire, Matt.
It was supposed to be, but as you know, we got in and did our research and really wanted to connect the story together. We're barely going to talk about the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, I think other than just talking about it right now here in the episode, the words probably won't come back up again. But the goal of this first season, or I'd say the midpoint, high point of this first season of our episodes, is going to be the Magna Carta, right? A foundational event in the history of liberty, the history of political development in Britain. And, all of the episodes so far, and really kind of the next one or two, are preludes to make sure that we're setting the stage, understanding all the various pieces on the chessboard and the backgrounds and the history that will help us get to that Magna Carta. And we can't explain the events that surrounded the signing of the Magna Carta without explaining the Byzantine Empire and the Muslim world and what was going on in the continent with the establishment of what eventually became France and the Holy Roman Empire and such.
Because it's all very consequential. We call these the Dark Ages because there isn't a lot of written history about the Dark Ages. You have the fall of Rome, and so writing goes away. I mean, there are some bishops, there are some kings, there are some people who write. We know a lot about Charlemagne because he well, I don't think he wrote. He did read. He didn't write anything. Excuse me. We know a lot about him because they left a lot of recorded written records. And so who knows what was happening in some of these other areas, but we focus on Charlemagne in history because of that written record. And this kind of illustrates the textbook view of history, right? Like we all go to school, we sit in world history, and you start chapter 7 and you're okay, we just finished the Roman Empire. Now we're talking about maybe some Huns and the Holy Roman Empire and Charlemagne.
Right.
But
right.
There's a lot more there.
There's a lot more there, and there's not we're doing episodes, of course, so we have clean breaks between episodes, and when you read history textbooks in school or even in college or whatever, there's those clean breaks, and what's we want to illustrate today is it's not a clean break from the fall of the Roman Empire in the West suddenly to next thing you have Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire and such. I mean, it is a continuous arc and story, and all those forces never stop and rest, just because again we don't have that same detailed history due to the lack of writing in this early Middle Ages, Dark Ages period. Doesn't mean that the evidence isn't enough there when you dig into it to see that the thread just continues all the way through.
Yeah, so let's jump back in where we left off in the year 395 with Theodosius I, dying just 4 months after the reuniting of the Eastern and Western empires, which leaves
Stilicho. Yep, Stilicho.
Stilicho's that sounds like one of the Marx brothers. He was a Vandal who was in charge of the West as Honorius, age 10, was too young. His older brother Arcadius was 17, and he inherited the East. So continue on.
Yeah.
What happened shortly after that happened?
Yeah, I mean, in that same year, the Huns, who we haven't talked about yet so far, they're not a Germanic tribe. This is a completely different people who we believe migrated from Central Asia through modern Russia, through the European steppe, right, and launched some of their massive attacks on the Holy Roman Empire in both the East and the West. And this invasion was like a key dominating factor into yet another round of all of those Germanic tribes migrating, as we talked about in episode 3, all the way, or even actually also in episode 4, migrating, all the way throughout, and changing the territories in which they live in and putting threats on the Roman border. So, the big year, or one of the turning points is in 407, when just massive amounts of Germanic tribes cross the Rhine, which had historically been that border territory between the Germanic tribes, the barbarians, right, and the very civilized Romans.
Well, but the Huns were frightening people. Like
they were.
Yeah, like go Google Huns basically in this era, because they had shaped their heads and looked almost like the cone heads, with a flat back, and then like they had a very terrifying look, and so they scared the pants off of people. But this just shows you that migration shapes history in a profound way as we see it today, as the Syrian refugees move into Europe, or Central Americans come to settle in America, and that changes different flavors of things. So that is definitely an important, because we tend to think, oh, it's all an invasion. But a lot of it was migration, and a lot of what we talk about in terms of Britain being settled by the Vikings, it wasn't all violent. That stuff stands out. A lot of it was, well, let's just move in and join the farming community and take a British wife. And it's kind of the same here, but the people who held power freak out and call them barbarians. Now, over these same years, Alaric the First emerged as one of the first kings of the Visigoths, the Western Goths, as contrasted with the Ostrogoths or the Eastern Goths. Alaric, had been a Roman soldier and had used chaos to rise in power and play Rome against Constantinople.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you remember from, when we detailed out where all these Germanic tribes came from and how their migration patterns moved, the Goths at this point had settled like kind of squarely between the power centers of the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire, right? And so Alaric was there to be able to be an ally at some times and pit them against each other at other times, and ultimately, gain power through that.
So, with the Germanic tribes fully present inside the former borders of the empire, and in most cases, at least notionally, as federati, Alaric finds his moment and sacks Rome in 410. Now, recall, this is the same year that Honorius tells Britain that they have to fend for themselves. So if the Huns weren't already enough of a menace, the famous Attila comes into power in 435 and fully consolidates power in 444. We were talking before the show that, like, Attila the Hun, you've heard that, and it's, like a famous name in history. And I think people kind of go, oh, is that the guy that came over the Alps with the elephants? Or is that the guy that came from Mongolia and invaded Russia? Like, I think some of these names sort of, Matt, you get confused. You're not totally sure who Attila the Hun is and where they appeared in history, because, a lot of these people lived 1,000 years apart.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely, Chris. And while, again, we're ultimately trying to tell the story of modern politics and get, to like how that developed, I think it's important as we go throughout history to be able to sprinkle in the names and understand where they came into play throughout the course of history. So Attila is one of those examples here. And he fully consolidates power. He has massive military victories, is almost looked as invincible, and is extracting tribute from both the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Emperor, and just becomes insanely wealthy. And in one of his moments, he's trying to get an alliance with Valentinian III to then attack the Visigoths, who by this time have like run scared from the Huns and moved into what is now, what's Gaul, right? We've talked about Gaul a lot, so modern day France. And through this, Attila receives a letter from Honoria, who's the sister of the emperor, Valentinian III. And she's saying, hey, will you marry me? I'm supposed to be married off to this Roman senator. Here's my engagement ring. Please come rescue me. And Attila's like, okay, great. And then reaches back to Valentinian III and says, I want half of the Roman Empire as a marriage dowry for your sister. And Valentinian doesn't take too well to that. So Attila ends up moving off into military campaigns in Gaul. And, again, in one of these big battles in France, in Gaul, in the what's called the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, he's actually defeated in 451 by a unified force of Romans and Goths and Romans and Goths and others. And so he comes back to Italy ready to marry Honoria and, exact his revenge on Valentinian. And in an interesting, moment in history, Valentinian sends out Pope Leo III and two other Roman senators, Pope Leo I and two other Roman senators to go negotiate and try to hold Attila back. And wonder of all wonders, Attila does, right? And in the history doesn't really know what exactly happened, what Pope Leo said to him, but he is given all the credit of telling Attila to go home.
Yeah, that's kind of, and then the Huns are never a threat again. And this is sort of a common theme is you have a great man of history like Attila the Hun, or we'll see with Charlemagne that springs off of a lesser predecessor who sets the stage. The great man comes and builds up something big, and then it's just in their wake like a bunch of losers. Right. This is a very common theme throughout history. So let's talk about the political state of Europe at the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So 25 years following Attila, Europe continues to be mired with the dynamic of emperors dealing with military generals who often wielded more power, as we saw in the Fall of Rome episodes. And they're balancing alliances with Germanic tribes and trying to hold back the other tribes who threatened the Roman territory. Now, by 476, it's over when
Odoacer.
All right. I'm not great with names. I've never been with names. So listeners of this program are just going to have to get used to it.
I've also heard Odoacer. I think either one is probably all right.
And he gained control of Italy and was even acknowledged by Constantinople and Emperor Zeno as the king of Italy. Now we're skipping some good stories, Matt, aren't we?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, and that'll happen throughout this episode, and little known stories. But once you dig in, they're really good. But unfortunately, we're just gonna have to move past a lot of them.
But that's part of why we do the show notes, so you can go back and look. And then the reading lists are comprehensive. So every episode, you could probably spend 2 years reading just the books that we've collected that we have read over the history of our intellectual pursuits. We put some podcasts, some documentaries, some various things to help you kind of learn some more of these stories. So make sure that you check that out in the show notes. That's available to members at historyofmodernpolitics.com. But there's great stories like Aetius, Theodoric, Majorian, Ricimer, and many, many more.
That's right. So now we're in 476, and I don't want to. This will be a little dense, so we want to go kind of quickly. But we want to give you a decent tour of like, okay, who's where in 476 when, at least according to, if you have to put a break in history of when the fall of the Western Roman Empire happened, like what does the rest of Europe kind of look like at this point? So starting kind of due to the north, in what's north of Italy, modern day Switzerland, you have the Alemanni people. So this is a Germanic tribe. I think we touched on them briefly, and they're operating somewhat independently in the Rhine Valley. You move to the east, we have a very short-lived kingdom of the Rugii. They emerged after the fall of the Huns, because this is the territory that was the central power of the Huns, sitting north of the Balkans. And they end up ultimately getting conquered quickly by their neighbors to the east, who happen to be the Ostrogoths. They're led by Theodoric, later known as Theodoric the Great. And this is different than the Theodoric we already talked about. This episode is going to be crazy with names of people that are like the same name over and over again. So this is like one of the first examples here. And at this time, they're federati, which I don't think we've covered what a federati means. And we'll get into this deeper in the next episode. But think of it as a, they're operating under the kind of cooperation, but subordinate to, in this case, the Eastern Roman Empire. So at this point, Ostrogoths are aligned to and kind of a sub-kingdom of, but still independent of the Eastern Roman Empire. And Theodoric is just kind of settling into the power, and he eventually goes around in 493, and the Ostrogoths conquer Italy, okay? And then the last piece, before I turn it over to you, Chris, is in modern-day Croatia and the Dalmatian Strip, you have a rump state, or a former remnant of the Western Roman Empire, ruled by Julius Nepos, who thinks of himself still as the Western Roman Emperor, but has no power, and he's quickly, assassinated by Odoacer, and Odoacer comes over and takes control of that territory in 480.
Yeah, so one thing that people need to understand is the two empires, the Eastern Empire, which is, over more towards, Turkey, modern day Turkey, and then the Western Empire, which is over more towards modern day France. The Eastern Roman Empire remained powerful for a long time after the quote unquote fall of the Roman Empire versus the Western. The Western Empire collapsed under the weight of these many different tribes. And so the still powerful Eastern Roman Empire under Zeno spanned from the Balkans and modern-day Greece through modern-day Turkey and all throughout the Mediterranean coast down the Levant, which is like, think Israel, Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula, the Nile Valley, to modern-day Libya over on the northern coast of Africa. Now, the Vandals had established their territory along the central and western Mediterranean coast of North Africa and also held some islands, including part of Sicily. The Visigothic kingdom held most of the Iberian Peninsula, including the Suebic kingdom in the area of modern-day Portugal, which is next to Spain, and had territory well into Gaul, which is modern-day France and Germany. Landlocked to the northeast of the Visigoths were the Burgundians, which is one of my favorite names to say in history. The Burgundians is a great name. In northern Gaul, along the coast, was another rump state of the Roman Empire called the Kingdom of Socians, or the realm of Sigarius. Now, finally, to the north of the Socians and also sharing a border with the Burgundians and Alemanni, are the Franks. So it's worth noting that our friends in the last episode, the Frisians, Saxons, the Jutes, the Angles, are further to the northeast and north of what we've covered. So the Franks are kind of like what, northern central France. The Frisians, Saxons, Jutes, and Angles are more towards Scandinavia.
Yeah. If you think like modern day Netherlands into even maybe parts of Belgium and over to like the northwestern parts of Germany is where the Frisians and Saxons are.
Gotcha. So this brings us to Clovis and the Franks. The Franks are very important, and out of the Franks are very strong in this period. And obviously, Francia, France, is sort of, again, where you start to see some of the modern things, the words that we use all start to develop. And like we said, you've heard of Charlemagne. You've probably heard that name. Maybe you've heard of Charles Martel. But Matt, not a lot of people have heard of Clovis. And Clovis was really, really important, wasn't he?
Yeah. I mean, he is the first to really unite the Franks and establish, rule over the territory of all of what is France today, after it was part of Rome, right? After it was part of the Roman Empire. So, you're tempted to kind of start your discussion of France with like, and then Clovis came along, but like he lives right in this period of time that we've been talking about. So at 476, which is the exact time that we're saying is the fall of the Roman Empire, Childeric the First is king of the Franks. So not much is known about him, but records seem to suggest that he had been in the Roman military, helped fight off the Visigoths, appears to have allied himself with Odoacer, and maybe even fought as a young man against the Huns. Childeric dies 5 years later in 481, and his 16-year-old son Clovis now comes to power as king of the Franks. And Clovis quickly moves to conquer Sigarius, that rump state of the Soissons, in 491. Maybe not quickly, but 10 years later. He's only 16 years old, right? So by the time he's 26, right, he's now conquered Sigarius. And through a series of political moves, he's working to build his support throughout Gaul. And he instead of trying to execute everybody from Sigarius's army, he incorporates them into his army. He takes a Catholic wife, converts to Catholicism, aligns himself with the elite, the Gallo-Roman elite, who do have that tie back to Christianity. And these political moves and military victories through that, he eventually unifies all of Gaul, taking significant territory away from the Visigoths and the Alemanni. So the Visigoths have now fully retreated into Hispania, the Iberian Peninsula, and the Alemanni are essentially incorporated into the Frankish kingdom.
Yeah, and in this story, we sort of see what we saw in the last episode in Britain. You have the Catholic Church start to develop some power. Part of that is because they bring some structure. They bring the written word. They bring bishops that have a higher authority that can be appealed to. And I don't mean God, I mean the Pope for most of these people, because being the cynical observer of politics that I am, a person like Clovis wants the Roman support so he can then claim the mantle of God and have the Pope on his side. And this is a very common theme throughout all of these stories. And that's partly why the Catholic Church becomes so powerful over time, because you see in Clovis a great politician. And a lot of these guys like Attila and Clovis, and they're good networkers. and they're good at gathering different tribes together and mediating between the different warring factions and creating a cohesive movement that aligns support. They realign the politics of the area. And so, when we're talking about, roughly 300 to 800, we're going from the Christian church being what we see in the book of Acts, starting in, Judea and expanding out kind of in the Holy Land. And during this period, you have people retreating like the Desert Fathers into Egypt. And there's a lot of, what the remnants now are the Coptic Christians in Egypt. There's some gestation there of the modern church. But then modern day Turkey in this period plays a huge role in helping propel the Christian church into what it is. And now we're starting to see it move into Europe. And you're starting to see the Roman Catholic Church develop some power. So we need to talk about some of how that developed, because if we're going to talk about the history of Britain, then we obviously need to talk about the importance of Catholicism. So in doing our research for the show, what have we learned, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, the Catholic Church really starts to grow and accumulate property through its legalization, right? That we talked about under Constantine. So it can't be understated in importance, but it's maybe not quite as straightforward as it might be on the surface. Being able to be openly Christian is obviously, an obvious benefit, that you're not being subject to persecution or death. But there's additional ways. So the church is allowed to actually accumulate property. And so when church followers give to the church, the church starts to acquire lands and become wealthy, and that is not then extracted back into the hands of the state, right? Into secular leaders. It's allowed to stay with the church, and accumulating land and wealth certainly leads to power. And in fact, it's not just sanctioned; it starts to become even endorsed, and then the elites start to follow suit. The church also starts to get its own legal jurisdiction. We'll talk about in a future episode kind of the history and development of law, right? But this is an important piece. The church actually starts to be able to run its own independent legal system and arbitrate disputes amongst people. And sometimes people would rather do that through the church than through the state. And that is another factor that really starts to drive additional power and influence to the church. And as the Roman Empire falls from Diocletian's autocratic utopia that he tried to set up through the ongoing civil wars and such into military chaos and dissolution, one of the safest and best places for those who wanted to be educated and learn and even have training to whether they went back into politics or secular leadership versus church leadership was in the church. And so the sanctuary of the church, had, writing and knowledge and all of these things that, was hard to come across in daily life in the secular world.
Yeah. So with these notes as a backdrop, there are just a few key individuals in the development in this period that we want to guidepost for you, because you've heard their names, and maybe just give you a little brief background. And then if you find them interesting, you can go and do your research. So let's talk about Ambrose. He was born in 340 in Gaul, again, France, Germany today, to Christian parents, and he moved to Milan. He was well educated and rose through the Roman secular government, becoming the governor of the province in 372. Remember, being the governor of a province was lucrative. And 2 years later, he accepted the position of Bishop of Milan, making him the first high-ranking upper-class Roman official to take the office of bishop, which tells you where the money's going. So he was well acquainted with Roman emperors. And if you recall, Christianity was made the official state religion of the empire in 380 with the Edict of Thessalonica. Now, Ambrose's political connections, education, and strong faith evidence through his writings were a major influence on the Roman upper and imperial class. He died in 397.
Yep. And then we move around the same period. Jerome, born in the 340s in modern Croatia in a Dalmatian village, he grew up well educated as well, converts to Christianity in the 360s while in Rome. It's part of his training and education. He goes on to transcribe one of the most famous translations of the New Testament. He also translates a lot of the Old Testament, but into the Latin Vulgate, which is the common language of the people throughout the Roman Empire. So he permanently relocates to Bethlehem, living in a small cave in a meager life, and continues his prolific writing and connections, with other people throughout the empire. Right? I mean, that shouldn't be understated. That just because, again, it's the Dark Ages, people are sharing letters and communicating, and word does travel, right? And so he lives in what was allegedly the same cave where Jesus was born from 388 until his death in the year 420.
Yeah. So, and let's just take note of the Vulgate and its importance in future episodes. But when you're talking about the people that we know and the history that we read today, a lot of it is because it was amplified, copied, and written down and during the fall of Rome, right? So we don't have Homer in his handwriting. We don't have Virgil in his handwriting. We don't have Paul in his handwriting. We have copies that survived things like the burning of the library in Alexandria. Had that not happened, then we'd probably have a lot more information. But the Bible, because of the Latin Vulgate and Virgil's writings, are the two most well-preserved ancient texts that we have, which leads us to St. Augustine of Hippo. He was born in North Africa in 354 to an upper-class family. He spoke Latin and had a job as a professor of rhetoric. And upon his conversion to Christianity in 386, he devoted his life to his faith and used his education and expertise to explain his views on theology and a wide range of philosophical and social topics. And he had been in many different streams of religions and philosophies. He had been a Manichaean, which Manichaeism you should look up. It's an apocalyptic vision. It's a very interesting religion that has some parallels to how people act today. He had been a Neoplatonist, and then he became a Christian, and he used that background to kind of synthesize everything. He was one of the most prolific Latin writers, one of the most well-preserved people that we have writings of. And he was really the bridge between the classical period and the medieval period in religious and political thought. And his writings set the tone for the next 1,000 years. And you can argue today of religious, political, and philosophical thought in Europe. It just cannot be understated how important Augustine is to the Western mind. And he's an important figure you should learn more about. And he was one of the first theological anthropologists, which relates how humans and God interact with each other and how that plays out in the social sciences. He also helped codify the doctrine of original sin, meaning that Adam and Eve's sin against God tainted nature and all of humankind. He also shaped the idea of just war. Whereas Christians had been pacifists, he argued Christians should be pacifists, but there are exceptions and certain criteria where not defending oneself or the vulnerable would actually be a sin. So that sort of led to a lot of our medieval kings and people today saying, well, if we don't do this, then we're sinning. We need to go to war. And then St. Augustine died in the year 430.
Yep. And then the last one we want to cover from this era is Leo, who became Pope Leo I that we discussed in the negotiations with Attila the Hun. Leo was born in 400 in Tuscany, and he had been a deacon and had an aristocratic background and put him in connection with high-ranking Roman officials. And he had actually been a diplomat arbiter on behalf of the emperor even before he rose to being a pope. So he had that reputation and those connections. And then, he was further elevated after being in the office of the Pope with his negotiations with Attila, which, many viewed as like a divine sign, like that it was a miracle that he was able to get Attila to walk away, and the Huns ultimately disappeared just a few years later. So he is referred in history as Pope Leo the Great, and he died in 461. So these four individuals who are basically all contemporaries, there's overlap amongst them all. They combined prolific writing, diplomacy, political connections, and all of this helped accelerate the influence of the church in the time when the power of the state was waning, which, kind of that perfect storm of things coming together, which really accelerated the influence of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, and on 2 points before we move back to France, because this is an important debate that shapes a lot of future conversations, and it is Arianism and the primacy of Rome. This still goes on between the Methodists and the Reformed people today in today's church. Arius was a church leader to whom the term Arianism is derived. And the debate over Arianism had to do with the nature of Jesus, namely whether he was the co-eternal with God the Father or distinct and subordinate. And this debate was central to the Council of Nicaea in 325 that Constantinople the Great called. Arianism was rejected as heresy by the church leadership. However, Arianism persisted and had many, many adherents. And this is very common. You have a lot of debates because, remember, it's not one clear line of we're all pagan, now we're all Christian.
Right.
And so Augustine was really, going back to Augustine, very important in reshaping the mind of the Western people from your tribal paganism to your Christian worldview that you see now. Now, notably, the Germanic tribes and kingdoms that converted to Christianity tended to adopt Arianism as opposed to Catholicism. In this way, Clovis was unique because he became Catholic and not Arian, like his Visigothic and Alemanni neighbors. So you see that blending of Arianism with existing religions. And, Matt, it's like one of those things that, Easter and Christmas were actually pagan holiday. That's where this comes from, because it was a political tool and useful at the time.
That's right. And then the other aspect is, as the Western Empire is crumbling, the Catholic Church did not, right? And the influence of church leaders that we just discussed continued the acceptance of Nicene Christianity in the Eastern Roman Empire. And the Bishop of Rome then thus remained important and recognized. And, if you recall the four main holy sees, bishoprics were Rome and Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria. Three of those are in the East, only one of them is in the West, right? And
right.
as the Eastern Roman Empire kind of tries to figure out, what they care about the most, in the West, it was just Rome. And this allowed, and the combination of, their claim to being, back to Peter as opposed to Mark, the disciples, really helped to further cement and establish this notion of primacy of the Bishop of Rome as the true Pope. If you remember, or true leader of the church, if you remember, like, the name Pope didn't really fully kind of come in and cement to the Bishop of Rome until, a few centuries later still at this point.
So let's talk about the Merovingian to the Carolingian dynasty. Let's jump back to France. As you study their history, you're going to run into the Ians, as I came to call them, the Merovingians. So tell us about Clovis to Charles Martel, Matt.
Yeah, so Clovis, his dynasty, the Merovingian dynasty, named after his, his grandfather Merovich, greatly expanded. He died in 511, and importantly, the Frankish people practiced a hereditary monarchy, but they also practiced partible inheritance, which means all your land and territory is split evenly amongst the sons, as opposed to just going to the eldest firstborn son, right? So this is an important piece of what's going to happen over the next few centuries. So Clovis has 4 adult sons, and the kingdom that he has created now gets divided into 4 places. And Chris, what happens when territory gets divided?
I would just think, the 4 brothers, they probably grew up together playing football with each other, just having fun with each other. Oh no, it ended up in civil war, intrigue, assassinations, chaos, tactical marriages, and all the typical things that we've seen throughout history. It's like 4, it's just like we saw with Diocletian. Good idea, not really working with how human nature works. So that's just what happened in the Frankish kingdom. That it broke apart. The power shifts and the sheer volume of murdering of family members that occurs over the next 200 years is just really amazing. in a bad way. And another part of the story that we will just have to skip past, to be honest with you, but it's worth reading up on. So we'll have to spare you of Theodoric and Childebert and
Clodomir
and Clothar and Thubert and all Theobald, all these Sigbert, all these cool people like Dagobert, Matt.
Yeah, all the rest of them.
Who doesn't want to learn about
Chilperic, right? Yeah, exactly. No, I mean some great names, and it really is just 200 years of chaos. The one person we'll just call out, you should go read about her, is Brunhilde. You know, she is a powerful female leader that actually like wields a ton of power through this chaotic era, like wielding her sons against each other and marriages and all sorts of good stuff. But so. You know, let's skip ahead. During that period, territory is changing off and on. Your favorite, the Burgundians, are incorporated into the kingdom. We get new names of various regions that come out through this: Neustria, Austrasia, and Aquitaine. And the name Francia starts to emerge in this era. And you know, now we'll get to Charles Martel. So we mentioned him in the cold open. He comes around the stage. He comes to the stage around 715. And is he a king? No, he's not a king. He is mayor of the palace, or if you've heard the phrase, the major domo. That's the role that Charles Martel has of Austrasia. And over the decades, this position had become increasingly more powerful as really kind of the grown-ups in the room and the real power behind what's going on, because the Merovingian kings are all fighting and killing each other and battling over dynastic power.
This happens a lot, like in the War of the Roses, for instance. The administrative state kind of keeps the steady hand while all the nobility is fighting each other. That's another common theme too.
Exactly. So this role, the mayor of the palace, is like the chief of staff or the CEO of the king's household. And household's not like the household of the family. It's the running the operations of the government, right? So Charles himself was an illegitimate son of Pepin II, and he was also mayor of the palace. So this mayor of the palace starts to become hereditary. And Pepin had gained control of all three palaces under his time, and decided to adopt the title of Duke and Prince of the Franks. So when Pepin died, his illegitimate sons were already dead, and he tried to pass his power to his 8-year-old grandson, who was legitimate. And there was enough of the nobility who backed Charles Martel, and after a few years of civil war, he takes on all of Pepin's power and adopts this title of the Duke and Prince of the Franks. And he goes on to rule the Franks for 23 years, notionally, even though they're still kind of a king. And that defeat of the Umayyad Caliphate that we talked about in the beginning was, really the crowning achievement. So Martel dies in 741. The major domo positions go to his two children. Charlemagne, a name we'll see a lot. Pepin, yes, another Pepin. This is Pepin the Short now. They actually get along. Shocker of shockers. Charlemagne retires and decides to devote his life to the church. So now Pepin has control over all of the Franks. He deepens the alliance with the church, deposes the last Merovingian king, is elected king of the Franks in 751, and this is now establishing the Carolingian dynasty. So his alliance with the Pope, helping secure territory in Italy from the Lombards, gives the papacy this elevated relationship between Rome and the Franks at this point. And this all ties back to the fact that the Eastern Roman Empire could no longer help protect the Pope and Rome, the Bishop of Rome, because they're busy fighting back the Muslims. And we'll refer to the Eastern Roman Empire heretofore as the Byzantine Empire, which is, really what history talks about this era as.
Yeah. Now, the most famous of the Carolingians was Charlemagne, and you've probably heard that name. Pepin the Short died in 768, passing the rule to his two sons, Charles and Carloman. This Carloman died in 771, leaving the entire kingdom once again united under one ruler. Now, Charlemagne did not stop there. He extended his empire throughout Italy by defeating the Lombards and east through much of what was known as the Avar Khaganate, a tribal society that held the region previously held by the Huns, the Rugii, and the Byzantine Empire in modern day Austria, Hungary, and Slovenia. He also conquered the Saxons to the north, creating a large empire in the west, not seen since the Romans. Notably, Charlemagne was crowned emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in 800, and he died in 814 with his only surviving son, Louis. And, he had a large bit of territory from, the top of Europe near Britain down to Italy over to parts of Spain even. So large expansion. And Louis the Pious, however, had multiple sons. So his successor, he tried to get ahead of the future problem and make a succession plan, which became messier when he tried to add another one of his sons to the plan, because you know how this works. Oh, well, it's like, oh, I want some. I didn't get enough. He got more than me. So the older brothers revolted and civil wars ensued, this time before Louis died. And when he actually died in 840, things continued to shake out until the Treaty of Verdun in 843, when the empire was divided amongst his three sons. So, Matt, tell us how this division of the empire worked out.
Yeah. All right. So buckle up. Lots of names here. So the eldest son is Lothair, and Lothair was named co-emperor while Louis was still alive, while his father was still alive, and received primacy over what became known as Middle Francia. And this was kind of an unnatural creation that went all the way from the English Channel down into Italy, included the capital city of Aachen, parts of Burgundy, not all of Burgundy, and the Frankish territory that goes down into Italy. And then he dies in 855, after which this kingdom is rearranged and divided amongst his three sons. So you get Louis II, known as Louis the Younger, and he's given the title of emperor and receives just the Italian portion. Louis II only lives until 875 and dies without an heir. More on that in a little bit. Lothair II receives the northern part of the kingdom, which is now referred to as Lotharingia, and Lothair dies also without an heir in 869. So his territory gets split, with the east part going to East Francia and the west part going to West Francia. And then finally, we have Charles, who receives the territory of the Provence and Lower Burgundy, but he actually dies much earlier and heirless again in 863. So his territories were split and incorporated to Lothair II and Louis the Younger that we just talked about. Got all that so far?
Yeah, I mean, it's just you see, it's more about the patterns. I mean, the listeners, we don't expect you to learn all these people, and you can check the notes if you really do want to. It just is about showing the pattern of how these territories develop in this age and how this all works. And so let's continue on with East Francia. It was given to Louis, nicknamed later in history as Louis the German, which includes Saxony, Bavaria, Austria, Alemannia, and Carthania. And Louis ruled from 843 until 876 in his death. And then his kingdom was split again amongst his sons. Charlemagne became king of Bavaria and briefly king of Italy after the death of his cousin Louis the Younger until his death in 880. His second son, known as Louis the Younger, took the kingdom of Saxony and succeeded his brother Charlemagne as king of Bavaria until his own death in 882. The youngest son, known as Charles the Fat, inherited Alemannia and parts of Burgundy. And he and his two brothers actually cooperated, which we know is rare. And he inherited all of his brothers' lands after their deaths by 882, which also made him emperor. Now, West Francia was given to Charles, known as Charles the Bald, who was much younger than his two brothers. West Francia was the western two-thirds of what we think of as the modern France. When his nephew, Louis II, the Younger, the son of Lothar, died in 875, the kingdom of Italy and title were claimed by both Charles the Bald and Louis the German. And the Pope sided with Charles and granted him Italy and the title of emperor. Charles had 8 sons and died in 877. Surprisingly, only his eldest son survived him. So Louis, known as the Stammerer, inherited West Francia. Louis made no attempt to claim Italy. It was at this time at Carloman, son of Louis the German, who was elected king by the Italian nobility. And when Louis the Stammerer died just 18 months after his father, West Francia was split between his 2 adult sons, Carloman II and Louis III. Louis died in 882, Carloman in 884, but with no heirs. And Louis had one other child that was born in 879, also named Charles. So if you're keeping track at home, despite all the divisions of the empire, there is only one adult heir in the entire lineage of the Charlemagne, and that is Charles the Fat, who through attrition now claims the entire Frankish kingdom in 885. And we leave at that point, Matt.
Yeah, so we're unified again, not necessarily through any major military conquests, but just through death and attrition and somewhat of cooperation amongst cousins and nephews and brothers and all sorts of craziness. And we'll pick up this story in a couple of episodes where we figure out what happens next to Charles the Fat and how that leads to our story back on the island of Britain.
Well, that ends this episode of the History of Modern Politics. My name is Chris Spangle. That is Matt Wittlief. We invite you to join and become an HMP Plus member, which is what I just decided to call it right now. Join the HMP Plus, and you can get the video. You can get early release, but sometimes by 6 to 9 months, you're going to get these episodes early. You can get the reading notes, the show notes, tons of great stuff when you join as a member at historyofmodernpolitics.com or wallplus.com. Thank you to all of our We Are Libertarians listeners, and thank you to our patrons there. Thank you so much, Matt. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris.
We will see you again in 2 weeks.